So we talked about PTSD the last time that I was on this quest to talk about recovery and understanding what PTSD is, the main causes that will bring it on, and the four main causes that I mentioned last time that generally people will say these are severe traumas that can cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, are if the person has gone to war and experienced combat. That's the first one that's mentioned a lot. Natural disasters, like, a terrible hurricane or being in a fire, flood, something very severe, a tornado. So a natural disaster. Then the third one is if you are in a car accident, a motorcycle accident, something that is life-changing in that instant and that might have a prolonged effect, like you've lost a limb or you are now, paralyzed or things like that. I mean, that in and of itself can cause PTSD, the actual, result of something, but an accident, something that's traumatic where time slows down and then you see yourself go through this traumatic incident like a car accident. And then the fourth one is sexual assault. And that kind of lumps everything into those two words. And sometimes there are sexual assaults that are less traumatic or severe, but it depends on the personality, the upbringing, the background of the person. But sexual assault is usually the fourth of the ones that are most commonly mentioned. So I wanted to reiterate how important it is that we realize that PTSD can happen to anyone. It is definitely not a sign of weakness. It's not like, oh, I got this because I was weaker than, the guy or the gal next to me. That's not it. It's how your brain and body and nervous system, your mind and your emotions, how they process trauma. And so certain things that might seem like a lesser trauma to a person listening to trauma all day long might say, well, that's not that big of a deal. But to the person that experienced it, it may be a huge deal, a big effing deal. So you can't judge and you shouldn't judge yourself. I think that's important to know that PTSD is not a sign of weakness, and so many factors can increase the chance that someone will have PTSD or decrease the chance that someone will have PTSD. And most of those things are not under anyone's control. So first of all, a very intense and long-lasting trauma, a traumatic event that you have no control over, can be what causes PTSD. So if you are injured during an event, that has been caused upon you, like even sexual assault or abuse can cause, a physical outcome, and that in and of itself can make you develop PTSD because of what it did to you sexually, what it did to you physically, what it did to you emotionally and mentally. And that could be a car accident. Same thing. What did it do to those functions that are so key and innate to human beings? What did it do to you sexually? What did it do to you physically, mentally, and emotionally? These are the ways that trauma over time can eventually cause PTSD. So if we know that it's not our fault, it's not a sign of weakness, I wanted to just mention that there are certain, facts about PTSD that are statistics. Sometimes people tune out at this point, but I don't want you to tune out. I want you to be thinking about yourself or a loved one or someone that that you think, the way that we're talking about PTSD, I wonder if this person actually has it, but has never been diagnosed and therefore has never gotten the treatment that they need. For example, if you're in a relationship with someone that is highly volatile, the person is constantly either on a high or in the depths of despair, that can be a sign of someone who has experienced some sort of ongoing trauma that has caused PTSD and yet they've never been diagnosed and they've never gotten the right therapy or treatment for it. So I think it's important, like, to understand. It could also be bipolar disorder, or it could be, I mean, there's a number of things it could be. But again, like when you're trying to search out a diagnosis for anything in the physical realm, it is not an easy process to figure out what's wrong. You can start having symptoms and be like, what is going on with me? For example, some people will have symptoms like my friend had this symptom of this pressure on her ears, and where her she could hear, but she felt like there was this intense pressure on the ear, like it hurts, like there's this something pressing on my ear. But one doctor, who was a gynecologist, wouldn't pick up the instrument that was hanging on the wall and poke the little thing in her ear to see if there was something wrong with her ear, because, well, that's not what I do. I'm a gynecologist. I do this. I don't do that, even though I have the thing hanging on my wall right behind you. And so you walk out of one office and you're like, okay, well, there's this, and it looks like, my female organs are doing okay, but I have this pressure on my ear. So you go to the next person, you go to the next doctor, and they look at your eyes and they say, well, your vision looks fine, but I can feel this pressure on my ear, and maybe it's kind of like right behind my eye too. And what's that? And again, they don't know. They have no idea what you're talking about because your eye looks fine. So not getting the right diagnosis, because this friend was eventually diagnosed with MS, a very severe condition. And I'm hoping to have her on the podcast and interview her really soon, because I think that those sorts of physical traumas that are long, it took like over a year and a half, 2 years before she was finally diagnosed, because nobody could get the right diagnosis. So people, for me, that have been through sexual trauma and assault, violence, rape, incest, molestation, any of those things that we talk about so much in what I'm trying to help the world, heal from, is that if they don't get the right diagnosis, they can't get the right therapeutic treatment. And I think that this is comparing it to a physical diagnosis that can also cause PTSD, is also comparing that to an emotional diagnosis, a mental diagnosis, so that people know what they have and that it does have treatments. Because otherwise you just walk through life with this terrible, anxiety, depression, rage, fits of crying, and then all the other things that can come out of a very traumatic experience. Alcohol, addictions, cutting, anorexia, bulimia. There's so many things that could maybe be avoided if we knew what was at the heart of what was going on with our mental health as well as our physical health. So here's a few facts that are just based on the US population. And some of these numbers might be a little bit higher now because more people are getting the diagnosis that they need. They're taking care of their mental health. So like I said, some of these may be even higher right now, because this is based on a long study that was done a few years ago. This came out. And according to this particular study, about 7 or 8 out of every 100 people, so 7 to 8% of the population, will have PTSD at some point in their lives. That's a lot of people. 7 or 8 out of 100 people is a lot of people. So probably if you know 100 people, which almost everybody does, even if you don't realize it, you might be able to help 7 or 8 of those people in your life that you now know a little bit more about PTSD, or yourself. You might be able to help yourself if you see that some of these symptoms are chronic. They are ongoing. They have this depression, this anxiety, this rage all the time. They didn't have it before and now they do, and it's ongoing. You might be the person that helps somebody or yourself get diagnosed with PTSD, which then means you can get a treatment plan in place. So about point two, about 8 million adults have PTSD during a given year. So during any given year, there's about 8 million adults that have been diagnosed with PTSD. And this is only a small portion of those who have gone through a trauma. So a lot of people who have gone through a trauma, they are able to, have things regulate because they have support, because the trauma didn't affect them long term. But other people have a trauma that affects them long term, more than a few months. And so this is the 8 million people, adults, that they're talking about in a given year. The third point is that about 10 of every 100 women, or 10%, develop PTSD sometime in their lives. So 10 out of every 100 women, or 10% of women, develop PTSD sometime in their lives, compared with about 4 out of every 100 men, or 4% of men. So it's more than double that PTSD happens as a mental, as this post-traumatic stress disorder in women than in men. So that leaves, I guess, me to wonder, that's those who have been diagnosed that we know of. So how many men and women who have never considered that the things they are experiencing over a long period of time might be PTSD, might be because of a traumatic event or a series of events that happened throughout their childhood, tweenhood, teenhood, young adulthood, and now, after many, many years, the results of those traumas are now starting to come forward. So another interesting thing about this study is it says personal factors like previous traumatic exposure, so maybe they've had some other traumatic exposure, and then this one straw is the straw that breaks the camel's back. So that's part of it. That's a personal factor. Their age and their gender. So it doesn't give me a lot of specifics as to why one gender or what age where PTSD may be more common. It doesn't give specifics, but I think it's interesting that all of these things go into, how come this person gets PTSD whereas this other person doesn't, who went through some traumatic things too. Some people just have a little bit stronger, maybe, ability to brush something off or to get back to their present life and not having nightmares or whatever those things are that are results that often indicate that you might have PTSD. But also, I think it's interesting with the men being only 4%, whereas women are 10%, might be just because the expectation of men has been to have this mental toughness that is talked about all the time. And maybe they would not report maybe they don't talk about the symptoms that they have as frequently, and they don't go and get help as often as they could or as they should, maybe, because of course we want everyone who is experiencing PTSD to get the treatment that they need, because it actually has a treatment plan. So what happens after the traumatic event is also important, according to this study. It says stress can make PTSD more likely, while social support can make it less likely. So I believe that I had so much good social support, which is why I believe in community so strongly, that for a person who has experienced sexual assault and abuse as a child up through, their young adulthood, that without community of support, other people, peers who have also been through those things, it is very hard for a person to really heal what is broken, because certain things have to be healed with other people involved. You can't heal a relationship unless you are having relationships with other people. So when it talks about this, that if you have a strong social support, a strong community network, that it can be less likely. Whereas if you have a high level of stress in your life, constantly, whether it's traumatic incidences or it's just food insecurity, violence in the home, domestic issues that, a young person has witnessed with their parents. There's so many things where if your life has been filled with stress, just high stress for many, 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 many years, and then you get out of that situation, you're more likely to develop PTSD if there's another traumatic event, the one that pushes you just a little bit over the edge. And so I find that really important to realize that our social support system is critical. It is so important. And if we don't have one, like we don't naturally have one with, good siblings, friends, parents, maybe a religious leader or somebody you look up to, you got to go find some support. You have to find a community of support. And of course, that's what Thrivivors, my online community, is built upon, is that without that community, it is very hard to heal. And so I think the more we talk about these things, like how common is PTSD, now you kind of know the statistics, and maybe they're a little bit behind because this was done a few years ago. Not that many years ago. It's pretty recent. So, but still, I think people are talking about things more now. And if you are having these symptoms, you're having nightmares, you're having panic attacks, you have rage that you can't figure out where it's even coming from, really. Because a lot of times in my own life, I will have a breakdown and just start crying about spilled milk. I mean, something so silly, or I'll have a reaction to just something so, I spilled my Whoppers on the in my car, and of course it's hot right now. So I'm like, oh my gosh, they're going to melt. And I was just like so stressed out about the Whoppers. And I just had to just stop myself and go, wow, that was really an overreaction to Whoppers. You really need to make sure that you are doing the self-regulation that you know how to do, that you're breathing like you know how to do, that you are actually practicing the power of now like is important, so that Whoppers don't cause you. I mean, I was almost crying. I just got so upset. I'm like, it's a box of Whoppers. So now that's not a very good experience. That's not PTSD. That's just me knowing that I overreacted and was more dramatic than I needed to be, and that I knew how to self-regulate and to not do that. And so I can do those things, right? Just my own observation of myself. So when you have flashbacks, when you have nightmares, when you have triggers, things that actually trigger you, if you are reliving an event over and over and over again, that is a symptom of PTSD. So again, reliving the event over and over again through nightmares, through flashbacks, or triggers that then make you think, something else that's triggered that. That is one symptom that is a very, very common and what you would consider one of the four main PTSD symptoms. So reliving the event. The second one is if you are avoiding situations that remind you of the event. So let's say the traumatic event was in a relationship, and now you just avoid all relationships. You get very solo in your life. You're the lone wolf. You go to your bedroom. You don't take any risk because you are avoiding any situation that could remind you of the event, or that you might experience something similar to what happened before. So that's the second symptom of PTSD. The third one is if you have these negative changes in beliefs and feelings. If you are like, everything that you used to believe in is now like thrown in the trash. Like there is no good in the world. There is no redemption for people. There should never be forgiveness. There, not a belief system that has to be based on religion, but just believing in yourself. That's another key one. Like, I am worthless. I am never, if you're using words like never going to be able to, manage my life, get the right job, keep the right job. I'm never going to have relationships again. It's never going to happen. Or I always am upset over, these things, and it will always be that way. So any kind of a big negative change in beliefs and your feelings about yourself, about life in general, that is definitely a symptom of PTSD. Often that is the first thing that people go and seek out a therapist for, because they're like, I can't live in a world where I don't believe that there are any good people, but I don't believe there are any good people in the world anymore. Or I can't live in a world where I think I'm going to feel this crappy for the rest of my life. I would rather, end it all now, today. These are the things that, if you can see that you had a different way of believing in the world and in yourself and in humanity, and now all of those feelings have changed into a negative pattern of belief, into these negative patterns of feelings where you never feel good about yourself or about other people or situations or places that used to give you joy, there's just nothing there but pain, that is a symptom. Okay, the final one is being in a state of what is called hyperarousal, like where you're always keyed up. Your feelings are always on high alert. They're always like over the top. It's like you are always in a state of, I'm going to fly into a rage, or I'm going to fly into an emotional breakdown. Or, if you are having that all the time, where you are constantly in that state of mind, of hyperarousal in your body, in your emotional body, your physical body, your mental body, that is also a symptom, a common symptom of PTSD. So, what I want to say about this is that symptoms may not, this is the final thought on this, symptoms may not actually happen right as soon as the traumatic event is happening or over. This is so important. They may not appear until months or years later. So this is the power of how the brain is trying to protect you so that you will survive. But at some point, those memories or those triggers or those things that have been latent will come out, and all of a sudden these are the symptoms, and you're like, what is going on? How am I crying for 3 days at a time? How is it that I cannot get myself up out of bed and get dressed and put some makeup on, or just even comb through my hair and go downstairs or go outside? I have no desire to do any of these things. Those are the thoughts and the feelings that come, and it may be years after that traumatic event or series of events. So I just think it's important to know that sometimes they'll come and go. These PTSD symptoms can come and then they'll go, and then they'll come and then they'll go. And if you're experiencing, periods of time where you're in a really heightened state of, oh, life is awesome and wonderful and fantastic, and I'm in love, and I'm this and this and this, and then you experience the complete opposite. I might as well just crawl in a hole and die. Life is not worth living. I mean, those things, that could be PTSD. I'm not a therapist. I am certainly not a person that could diagnose anybody, but I could at least notice in my friends and family and myself if those things that we've mentioned could possibly be PTSD. And just like I would help somebody like my sister, my friend that have, physical ailments that are really severe, and I would help them try to find the answer to what was going on because I care about them. I would say, care about yourself. If that's what's happening to you, you need to go and be diagnosed so that you can get the treatment plan. And the next time we will talk about various treatments and are there treatments for PTSD. So I just think if you have symptoms that last longer than about 4 weeks, I would give yourself no more than 4 weeks. To me, waiting, months, it just could be very, very destructive. What happens in your life, whether it's what happens to your relationships, what happens to your self-care or self-harm, all of those things, anything that causes you great distress, anything that interferes with your work, your home life, that really does interfere with your work, that really does interfere with your relationships and your home life, and it is chronic more than 4 weeks, I say you might have PTSD. All right. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you on the other side of trauma.